is the story of Genesis, the story of creation. There's beginning of life. So Noach represents the next stage of life, which is corruption. You know, we all begin our lives innocent, pure, and then things happen. Every one of us has our moment where we lose our innocence in different forms and fashions. Hopefully for most of us it's not in any traumatic and dramatic way. But everybody, life begins in a very pure way as a newborn, but then we enter into a world which isn't so perfect. So the chapters of the Torah, which reflect really life itself and history, and also in a microcosm, our own personal lives, the chapters also reflect this sequence, where Bereshis really talks about creation, the Garden of Eden, the way things are what were meant to be, and Noach, the way things become. You know, Henry Kissinger writes in his memoirs that when President Nixon resigned during the Watergate scandal in the early 70s, so that last night when they prayed together and Nixon was about to sign his resignation, which of course was a quite unprecedented thing that never happened before, never has happened since, that a sitting president would resign. So Kissinger writes that Nixon, as he was walking out of the Oval Office and to the room where he would sign those papers, he stopped by a big portrait in the White House of John F. Kennedy, the late John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1963. So he stopped by the portrait. There's a famous portrait with Kennedy sitting like in a chair in a very pensive pose, with his head on his arm, and this is what Kissinger says. Kissinger writes that they heard Nixon speak to the painting, you know, muttering or whispering. He said to the paintings, they says they love you because you remind them of who they want to be, and they hate me because I remind them of who they are. So John F. Kennedy, Camelot, you know, became like a fantasy. Whether he was or not is another discussion, but at least in people's minds, especially after he was assassinated, he became a god, you know. So he reminds people of who they want to be, and Nixon said, and I remind people of who they are, which explains why Nixon was so hated at the time. So in many ways you can say there are two parts to our lives. There's, you know, who we want to be and who we are. And who we want to be doesn't necessarily mean it's a delusional or an illusion, but usually our dreams and aspirations obviously are something that we're not yet there, or else it wouldn't be a dream. So when we dream and aspire for something, to find, let's say, healthy love in our lives, or to actualize our potential, or in any other way to develop, make our mark on the universe, and whatever shape and form everyone does such, that's a dream and aspiration which hopefully in life we'll get part of it, but it's hard. But usually we don't fulfill all our dreams. And then there's who we are, our present state of being. And Judaism actually likes to put it into three stages. There's how you begin your life in a very pure way, as I said, a very innocent way, but you haven't yet faced the difficulties of life. Then there's life that, as it breaks us and challenges us, and then there is what we do with that. Do we still continue to grow, and do we still are able to overcome the obstacles or impediments that life has presented each of us in our own way, and find some deeper peace, a greater place to reach to. So in a way, the first chapters of the Torah reflect this. Bereshis is the beginning. You know how things began, the freshly fallen snow before any human being trampled on it. The new child, the newborn child. Noach begins immediately that the world has become corrupt. On a microcosmic level, on an individual, personal level, it's how we have now faced the darkness of life. Whether it's the greed, the corruption, ourselves, excuse me, or the people around us. And as you'll see, the end of Noach begins a positive, upbeat thing where the world is rebuilt after the great flood. And chapter 3 starts the story of Abraham, who brought great light into this world. So right there, you can say, smack right there, the first 3 chapters of the Torah are a microcosm, are a mirror image of life. How we begin, before we fall, how we fall, and what happens after the fall. Now many of us, of course, get resigned and don't pick ourselves up, or we stop dreaming and through enough disappointments, enough broken promises, enough shattered dreams and so on, we don't necessarily continue and forge ahead with fortitude and energy and power that would really help us grow. So the Torah tells us that's not the case. So this chapter is, as one of the Hasidic rabbis says, that this chapter, especially at the beginning, puts you in somewhat of a more somber mood. It's a little more melancholy because it talks about how the world is destroyed, self-destructs due to its own corruption. And many people compare it to our times today, that capitalism has reached its peak, has reached its edge, where ultimately greed begins to implode. And without the checks and balances, some argue that we're seeing now the end of capitalism as we know it. Which had a good run, some say, 200 years, 150 years, but the capitalism as we know it will not survive. Okay, it's arguable. There's no question that it's definitely going through plenty of market correction, no pun intended. And I would want to discuss that point right here. It's not the theme of this discussion. So many compare this to compare, if you read this chapter about how the world begins to turn on itself, when there's enough greed and there's enough self-interest, it begins to conflict with one another, we have a situation where, who do you trust? Who do you trust? The financial markets, the leadership we have. I mean, every day another piece of news that just exposes yet another corrupt individual. Money talks, and money has power, and some people have gotten away with it, and some haven't. So anyone that's not so naive and somewhat a thinking individual knows that for everyone that has been caught, there are probably 1,000 that haven't been. And bottom line is, if you can get away with something, how many people would you really trust without somebody watching them? And now when you don't have necessarily the checks and balances of overseers and stuff like that has failed the system, one has to wonder. Now nobody likes to think about an apocalypse, an economic apocalypse, because it's just too terrifying to think about. America can't go bankrupt, etc., etc. And I'm not here trying to plant any negative feelings or seeds. I'm not necessarily part of the Occupy Wall Street gang. But nevertheless, it does reflect on the resentment and the anger and a system that is pretty broken. And how far it'll go, no one knows. It definitely doesn't look so great, So in many ways, this chapter is a good reflection of how human beings can fall to the lowest. But the end of the story is always a happy one. From a Jewish perspective, and especially if you look at the Jewish people as a people, we've seen the abyss many times and we have survived. Not only survived, but thrived. So there's no question that we can make it through anything. But doesn't mean we should be naive or unrealistic about situations, When there's crime and corruption and greed, that's a reality. The question is, how do you transcend it? How do you protect yourself? So we have the story in this chapter, how Noah and his family are told to build an ark. And an ark that would protect them, refuge. So while the world was self-destructing and destroying, Noah and his family and the animals and creatures they brought into the ark were preserved. I've discussed this point many times, so I'm not going to go into it. I just want to mention it briefly. What it means on a personal level, the raging floodwaters represent all the corrupt forces of life, all the things that overwhelm us. They can be psychological waves and floods. It can be emotional ones, and it could also be, as it says, and sometimes it's just simply the overwhelming nature of having to make ends meet. Economic anxiety is actually used as an expression by some of the mystics to explain what means raging floodwaters. It's compared to economic anxiety over not being able to make ends meet, which can feel like a flood. Feeling like when you're like flooded with debt is even the expression. Overwhelmed, which again is a very strong reflection of many situations today, unfortunately. But at the same time, we also live in a very interesting paradoxical world, because we don't live in primitive times. We have unbelievable technologies and tools and blessings and resources available to us, which in a way makes things even more complicated. Because it's one thing if we were living in the Wild West, or we were living in maybe we are, but in our illusion, if we were living in a time where there was no progress, not in medicine, not in science, not in technology, not in basically in every area, communications, then okay, so commensurate to that, proportionate to that would be that the world is also quite unevolved, on a personal level, on a moral level. But we live on one end of the spectrum. The world is extremely advanced. Human beings have shown unbelievable prowess and aptitude in how they developed science and technology, and it continues to grow. I mean, you just have to look at the life expectancy. Just 40 years ago, 50, even 10 years ago, life expectancy was almost 10 years less than it is now. You know, if you go back half a century, it almost doubled from the beginning of the 20th century. You know, all you have to look is, I mean, no one should know of any death. Just open up any obituary column. The average, the age is there, 90, 100, 80, you know, I mean, these are all common numbers. So we see how medicine and how science has advanced. So when you have that contrast, and at the same time, on a personal level, we have unbelievable level of, the misery index is pretty high. Relationships are failing. You know, marriage, 50% ends in divorce. That's legal divorce. How many are divorced except by, in every possible, emotionally except on paper? And children are suffering. The contrast, it can be very jolting. Because on one hand there's such progress, on the other hand there's such, you can say, you know, we haven't changed at all. And we may be even worse, you know, with the indulgences of our times. So this whole chapter takes on a whole, if you make a very relevant message, maybe now more than ever, even though it's not a flood in this technical, physical sense of water rushing, even though we're having floods too, and I hear a snowstorm is about to come to New York this weekend. Yeah. I know a snowstorm, but a snow. Listen, the weather reports are notoriously impossible to predict. So I'm just sharing what I heard. I mean, you know, we had an earthquake here, right? And we had a hurricane. The only thing missing is a volcano, I think, in the context. Tsunami, I don't think can happen in this part of the world, but who knows? The point is that even the weather has been pretty interesting. If, you know, last year has not been very volatile. Even the weather, and definitely the year itself. You know, this year 2011 is turning out to be maybe one of the most dramatic years in history in the last 50 years. Since World War II, with you know, what's going on in the Muslim Arab world, and what's going on in the economy, and I mean, and it doesn't seem to be stopping with the death of Gaddafi, and all the details, and the rest of what is probably going to come. So we live in a time that is the extremes are very blatant, very glaring. The success and progress on one end, and seemingly on an emotional, personal level, things are pretty bad, you know. And they don't, and as much as many iPads as you may have, it doesn't resolve the emotional issues and the challenges that we personally have to deal with. So the solution in this chapter is that we must build an ark. You want to protect yourself from the floodwaters of life, you have to build some oasis. There's no way around that. That's a rule. What's the oasis? A teva. In Hebrew, the word ark, in this chapter, the word is used teva. Now, in truth, in Hebrew, there are different words for the word of a boat or a ship. There's aniyah, there's sfina, and there's teva. Teva is an ark. So the Baal Shem Tov says the word teva has another meaning. The word teva in Hebrew also means letters. Words, actually, words. Os is a letter and teva is a word. So that means essentially that when we are surrounded by by raging floodwaters around us, whatever they may be, as I said, psychological, emotional, economic, whatever they are, the way to protect yourself is not to run away or escape. It's not, obviously, you're not going to manage through swimming it through it. So you build an ark which learns how to float above it, because it creates some insulation, and you actually use the floodwaters it helps you rise if you have that protection. So what does the Baal Shem Tov say? Surround yourself, he says, with the refuge, the ark of refuge of words, of holy words of prayer and holy words of Torah, which is a form of a psychological and spiritual form of an ark that gives you stability even when everything around you may be unstable and uncertain. When you commit and you build yourself this sacred space, that creates stability, and nothing can compromise that if you build that ark. You don't build the ark, God forbid, then you are exposed to the elements. And that's the basic solution, that you have to have an ark of holy words. And that can be a classes, it can be through reading, through praying, in private, in public, however through groups. Something that gives you an ability to transcend the circumstances around you. And if you think about it, it's both simple and quite brilliant, because what it tells us is that when you study these words and you connect to them, they give you another perspective on life, and therefore the things that could have shaken you up yesterday become less frightening. It's really about understanding and creating a spiritual perspective to life, which has different resources and tools that usually a material world does not have. You see, materialism by definition is volatile, is ever-changing. You know, the food you ate yesterday did not last for today. The money you spent, everything that's materialistic, everything of the world of matter erodes, ages, and dies. So even while it's there, how secure can you really be? It's something that you know is constantly changing and temporal, and will ultimately erode and ultimately die. So even though it may look very powerful right now, but if you think about it, it's only as powerful as long as it lasts. Whereas spirituality by definition does not age or erode. So you can say the body ages, the soul does not. As a matter of fact, the expression is the soul actually gets younger, because it gets more powerful, because it's not exposed to and not shaped by the elements. So with years, as the years roll on, you become more powerful because you become wiser and more a broader perspective, more mature. Those are faculties that make a person much more powerful. But we do live in a world that worships matter. It worships youth, and it worships looks, and it worships things that seem powerful for the moment. You know, the sugar-coated power. Even though our minds may tell us it won't last, but if it looks strong and it's, instant gratification, that seduces us. So building an ark of words is really connecting to something that is beyond the here and now, and therefore can withstand its pressures and can withstand its challenges. It's not an accident that the Jewish people are here today, and at the same time they happen to have also a Torah that they never forsook. What did you say? Forsaked. Yeah, forsook. Right. As a matter of fact, we read the